After building in this system, I truly believe we are on the edge of changing how we build PCs going into the future. Let me explain why. So for a while we've seen different designs and concepts of reverse connection motherboards and cases. There was Gigabyte and Asus, and this specifically is the MSI Project Zero. But this is the first time I've actually built in a full system like this. And it really took me building in it once to kind of appreciate how I think things can go in the future, and specifically ATX. I know on this channel we've talked a lot about how ATX is kind of stagnant and like we need to move things into the future. This is actually kind of an indication of where I could see things going. Now in this video I want to go over kind of the build process in this one specifically, but also kind of just talk generally about how I think it can be a good indication of where we're going at in the future. So first up, let's talk about this system. This is the MSI Project Zero. It comes with a case and a, oh my God. Now we saw this at Computex. This is a combination of case and micro ATX motherboard, and when you look in it, apart from the actual design kind of stuff, you think, wow, look at this. There's very minimal wires. You know, you can kind of see one wire here. Obviously, you have the tube here, and the PCI power going to the GPU here. But for the most part, you know, you don't get those annoying headers or the huge motherboard 24-pin connector in the front, and I think that's why a lot of these companies have really been kind of leaning into, oh wow, like look how beautiful this looks. You have no wires or minimal wires, but I think they're kind of missing the point, because if I turn it over to the back and you see that once I had the motherboard installed, all it was kind of just plugging everything into the system to essentially get it up and running, which is kind of different. And I'll say, don't mind the cable routing. I kind of cleaned it up a little bit, but it's not the best cable routing ever. But I will say, being able to throw the motherboard in this case, and then not have to worry about taking the front panel headers and feeding it around through one side and doing that dance of going from side to side, being like, okay, well, where do I want to feed it through? Oh, if I have it in the wrong place, I got to feed it back through. So not having to do that little back and forth dance of feeding the cables through was actually a big help. And sure, I've built a lot of PCs, so if anything for me, it was just kind of a time saving measure, because I have no problem doing the routing. But I could see for new builders, this would be a game changer to not have to worry about figuring out which cable goes where and then having to figure out how to route it through. I literally just plopped the motherboard in, and then I had all the connections available to me right there, except for obviously the GPU. I mean, that's a whole separate thing. Asus thinks they have kind of a way around it. But that's why I think this specifically could really be a huge help for new PC builders and get people more willing to get into the system and less scared to build. And one of the things I found for myself building in this is that usually I start by placing the motherboard outside of the system and kind of installing components there and then putting it into the system. But actually I was like, you know what, this would make me feel better to just put the motherboard in, put everything I needed to in the front, and come around to the back, start wiring up and be done. Part of that was ease of use, obviously, but another part of that was building on the motherboard outside of the system, like having it on the box or some sort of anti-static mat. I was actually a little worried that the headers, because they were exposed, I was worried that any sort of pressure I put down on the system was actually going to kind of like damage those back headers. I don't think I did in this case, but maybe in the future for this kind of system, it would be easier to actually start building in the system, rather than building outside of the system and throwing it in there. Another major thing I want to note is that the 24-pin power connector, usually we kind of have to really push it in on this side, and it kind of starts to warp it a little bit. And I know some new builders might get kind of afraid that it's going to hurt it before you actually click it in there, because it's such a massive connection. It almost kind of introduced a little bit more stress, because doing that same amount of force and plugging it in from this side caused the motherboard to kind of start to push this way, which made me feel like, okay, well, if any of these screws are maybe loose, that you could cause a little bit more damage going this way as opposed to this way. But once again, maybe if this is the norm, and in the future, it just becomes common knowledge to maybe put your hand braced against the back of the motherboard when you push it in. I don't know. Another little thing to note. The other thing is that obviously with the connections on the back, you're going to need a little bit more space on this backside. Now I know there are cases out there, it's been kind of popular to have like a dual chamber kind of case, which is nice, but in a more standard layout like this, the problem becomes that this 24-pin power connector right here, it is thick, and depending on what kind of cables you have, I really had to kind of push it down to make sure that the side panel could go on. And as another little note, this USB 3 header that's plugged in the front here, I actually wish this had a 90-degree kind of plug to it, because once it was plugged in, this was actually like very, very close to the side panel. So, I think it kind of needs to rethink a little bit about those front panel connections as well. But, I mean, all in all, it did make my life easier. And once again, I do really think that new builders would feel more comfortable building in this system. I will point out that also this power supply is one of the first ones that I've got to get my hands on with that new 12-volt high power cable that has the yellow coating or the yellow plastic on the ends to show that it's fully seated. So once again, another nice little touch for new builders to know that they are fully seating their cable. Now I will admit, I don't think this is a perfect solution. I still think we're in the infancy of this, and obviously there's a lot of unknowns. Really kind of the biggest one is that companies need to start working together to make sure that the cutouts for cases are compatible with each other. I know a lot of companies are starting to kind of give combination motherboard and case, or in the case of ASUS, like has special GPUs that will use a proprietary slot to get power from. But as long as everyone kind of work together and start re-envisioning what this cutout would look like, then hopefully in the future we have more options available to us to say, you know what, I really like this case, but I want a motherboard from a different company. But just like the ATX spec, which is, Gordon has pointed out that it's actually a rather pretty loose spec, I think it's doable for companies to be able to kind of work towards a common good. And once again, they're really focusing on like the aesthetics of it, which is nice, and I do like the aesthetics of it. I really think the ease of building in it is kind of like the key, and what hopefully will drive us to a new future of PC building. So anyway, this is just my overall thoughts on this MSI Project Zero. If you want to see more PC hardware and software videos, be sure to subscribe here on PC World. Until then, I'll see you in the next video.